Hello, welcome everyone. Thank you so much for joining us this evening for our program on understanding the Marshall Fire and our changing wildland-urban interface. This series is building on a series that we did last year in 2021 that we're bringing back to you, kind of a special bonus episode. This has been put together in collaboration between CSU's Center for Collaborative Conservation and the Institute for Science and Policy. I'm Kristen Uhlenbrock. I'll be one of your co-hosts, and I'm the director of the Institute for Science and Policy. I see a number of people joining us here this evening, so thank you so much for tuning in on this snowy night. If you missed Nicole's call right before the hour, we'd love to see where you're watching from. Go ahead and open that chat and let us know where you're tuning in from. I do want to recognize that this topic is very sensitive to many of us and those in our community who have been impacted by the devastation of the Marshall Fire, which impacted more than 1,000 homes, as well as what we know is one individual who has lost his life. Our hearts and our thoughts absolutely go out to all of those that have been affected. In tonight's episode, we're going to hear some personal stories. We'll also provide you with some resources if you are interested in continuing to help out our community. As I alluded to, we did this series back in 2021 where we did a 4-part broadcast where we talked about forest fires and people. We covered a lot of ground in that series. We talked about the role of climate and weather. We talked about ecology and the management of forests. We talked about the indigenous approaches to living with fire, including ancient indigenous methods of living and dealing with fire on a regular part of their livelihoods. We talked about policy. We talked about preparedness. We talked about a lot of aspects, but one aspect we did not talk about and discuss was fire as it relates to the grasslands. So we hope that tonight's episode will cover a lot of ground, specifically focusing in on the Marshall Fire, what we know, what we're still learning, and just as importantly, what we hope we can be prepared for in the future here. I will say thank you very much for those of you who submitted questions in advance. They were extremely thoughtful questions. We received a tremendous amount. I also encourage you, if you have questions or comments throughout tonight's program, drop them into the chat. My co-host, John Sanderson, who will come on here a little bit later, and I will do our best to incorporate as many of these audience questions as we can. And I will give you my utmost apologies. We often do not get to all of your great questions, but we love seeing them. So hopefully you'll engage with us in the chat. Okay, let me bring on our first guest. We have 3 special guests tonight, but we do have one guest here at the top who's going to be joining me. It is Commissioner Matt Jones. Matt is currently a Boulder County Commissioner. Previously, he has served in our state legislature, serving as a Colorado State Senator from 2013 to 2019, as well as a state representative for 2 different stints from 2011 to 2013, as well as in 1987 to 1993. So he has a very long public service career. And in between some of those stints, he's had various leadership positions, including serving on the Forest Health and Wildfire Oversight Committee. And then, like I mentioned, between these stints in the legislature, he did lead the City of Boulder's Open Space and Mountain Parks Department, serving as an environmental planner, and also did some wildland fire work. I don't know if you know this about Commissioner Jones, but I read that he's also was a pro mogul skier in his 20s, which is a fascinating feat, as well as the 2-time cancer survivor. Commissioner Jones, thank you so much for being here this night. Really grateful to have you and your time and your leadership, knowing this is a very personal issue to you and your community. I'm wondering, could you just share a little bit with our audience, what was December 30th like for you and your neighbors in your community up in Louisville and Superior and Boulder County? Oh, Commissioner, I think you're on mute.
Thanks, Kristen. I appreciate the opportunity to be here with the audience and kind of spread the word. My name is Matt Jones. I'm a Boulder County Commissioner, and I live in Louisville. I used to, when I did wildland firefighting as part of my job at the City of Boulder Open Space and Mountain Parks, and also when I served in the State Senate doing advocacy work for forest health and forest mitigation work and wildland firefighting, say, this is important work, but it will never happen to me. I was wrong, dead wrong. And that's true of the whole Front Range, by the way. let me tell you a little bit about my story of that day, and then some ideas of what you might be able to do to take action. So I got a call from the Sheriff Pelley, at about 11. He said, we have 2 fires. And this is when we had high wind events. And so that's, you don't want fires on a high wind day, of course, so you don't want them anytime, but that's worse. One's north of town, one's south of town. I think we have a box on the one north of town, but the one south of town, I'm really worried about. So I want to go out and see what this looks like. So I got in the car and I was going to the 36, going to get on 36 and go to the overlook a lot of you probably know about. And I could not see more than 40, 50 feet. And I said, that's a dumb idea. So I turned around and went to an overlook, Davidson Mesa, to take a look at the fire. And it had a flat plume. It was, I've never seen anything like it. And I said, this is bad, I got to get home. So I went back to the car and decided not to go down to Main Street, McCaslin, because it was exposed to the wind, and went through a neighborhood that was gone 5 hours later. I didn't know that. And at this time, I'm going home. My wife calls and said, we got an evacuation order. I said, it can't be, right? That doesn't happen here. She said, yeah. And I confirmed that. And so we went home and we weren't ready for this. We're pulling together P's, your pets, your papers, your personal computer, your pills, and doing all of that. And then I got a text that I have to sign an emergency declaration to get aid as chair of the commission. And I didn't want to take the time, but I did. Thank God for cell phones and DocuSign. And that got done, and the governor signed it later that night, and the president signed his declaration the next morning. It was pretty amazing to me. But we loaded up the car with our 21-year-old cat, Ari, little black cat, and my wife and I. And we Googled our way out of here, go to Google Maps, trying to figure the best way out. People were so gracious, it blew me away. Everybody's freaking out. They could see the stuff coming. And then we went to the Disaster Assistance Center, and I watched the news report, and I realized how bad it was. That's when I really became afraid for our home. So we got a hotel room in Gun Barrel, and we watched with intense anxiety, trying to figure out any data point to tell us what was happening to our home. I hated my neighbor's doorbell cam because I think it's an intrusion on privacy. I've come to really like my neighbor's doorbell cam. It was one of the few data points we had. And we were out, and then we got word that our house was probably standing the next morning. I was guessing from some aerial photos I looked at. And so my wife came back to the house and it was intact. And because we have an electric heat pump, we circulated inside. The smoke smell wasn't bad in the house. And then we came back permanently 2 days later, and our house was here. Our neighborhood was here. It blew me away. My wife pointed out these things in the front yard. Those are parts of people's houses. That meant we had a lot of embers coming down, and that's how the fire spread in this environment. We're darn lucky that this was here, but then it set in. How many people weren't so lucky? And the numbers kept going up and up and up, and then you find your friends and your acquaintances, and it was overwhelming. Trying to sort through all of that. And I never thought this would happen to us, and I knew this stuff, I thought. But what it is that it's a new day. We had the driest 6 months on record, the last 6 months of the year on record. Climate change has done this. The county's still recovering from the 2013 flood that probably was increased in severity from climate change. We think FEMA still owes us $20 million. We just finished the last road last year. That's how long it takes you to get back out of these things. But we're rebuilding and trying to help people get back on their feet. And it's really hard emotionally. It's more hard for them, I'm sure. But it's just this ever-present, I don't know, heaviness to what we're doing. But at the same time, people are resilient. They're great. They're gracious. They're nice. So that's where we are. And there's a lot of questions people want to get going, and we're trying to move as fast as we can to help them. So here's the three things I'd throw out to you if you want to help. Number one, donate to the Community Foundation of Boulder County. They're doing great work. They're up to 30 million bucks. That's not near enough. People are underinsured like you wouldn't believe. We checked our insurance, we're underinsured by 26%. If you haven't done your insurance in the last 2 years, you're uninsured, is my guess. So that's the kind of thing we need to help people with to get back in their homes. Just get back in their homes, not the fancy new one, just the same one. Secondly, act on climate. Do it individually in your choices. Get an electric vehicle. They're fast, they're quiet. Get an electric heat pump. Do those things and work on it at a systematic level, because that's where we got to change things. Don't believe the propaganda from the oil and gas industry on TV. They're wrong. Oil and gas the gas is every bit as dirty and polluting as coal from a climate perspective because of all the methane. We've done studies in Boulder County that found over 2 years, the wells, 60% of them leaked. We got the companies to fix them. We asked them to, and they did. And 30% of those still leak later. This is an emergency. We need to get off of fossil fuels. So that's the bottom line. Secondly, and if they tell you it costs you too much, you know who it's costing now? It's regular people. And so it's time to make action to change. And finally, act on resilience. I saw the people signing in, from Fort Collins to Littleton to Arvada. You're all at risk. It's a new day. So listen to what people have to follow me to do. Gather your important things. We left things behind because we just didn't think of them. Do that kind of work because we're in a new time. And I'm just so proud to be part of Boulder County, quite frankly. The employees there are just great humans. And unfortunately, fortunately good at natural disasters. We've had 4 fires and 1 flood in the last dozen years, but they're doing great work. And those are kind of things that give me heart.
Thank you, Commissioner Jones, for joining us this evening, for sharing a little bit of what the day was like for you and giving our audience some concrete, specific ideas of what they can do to be supportive. Very grateful for your leadership and for joining us this evening. I'm very grateful that you and your wife were very fortunate in the situation, knowing that many in our community and your neighbors were not. So thank you very much for being here with us.
Thank you.
Great. All righty. As Commissioner Jones alluded to, we are going to cover a lot of ground this evening. He set us up very well to talk on a lot of trying to unpack what we currently know about the Marshall Fire and put it into some of these bigger contexts, including globally, what do we know about climate change and the role of drought and climate and weather impacting fires. We're going to talk a little bit about what he also just alluded to, which is the changing wildland-urban interface and how we should be thinking about that, and as well as maybe some policy and preparedness ideas. So I would love to bring on my co-host, John. You're here with me tonight, right? So John is my co-host. For those of you who've joined us, John and I have done a number of programs together. It's always a pleasure to do something with John. He brings a really thoughtful eye to these conversations. He is the director for CSU Center for Collaborative Conservation. I'm so sorry. John, good evening. Thanks for being here.
Yeah, thank you, Kristen. Thank you, Commissioner Jones. And thanks to all of you who have joined us this evening for this important conversation. So glad to be here. Glad to be here with you, Kristen. And I'll go ahead and introduce our next 2 very special guests. The first one I will mention is Dr. Jennifer Balch, who is the director of Earth Lab and associate professor at the University of Colorado Boulder. And Dr. Balch is also a fellow at the Cooperative Institute for Research in Environmental Sciences. Jennifer researches the role of fire on Earth across the globe and right here in Colorado including understanding the processes that disturb ecosystems and their recovery. Her research explores global patterns of human-caused changes to the climate and also to land cover to better understand these causes and help inform people about opportunities to curb and also to adapt to these changes. So welcome, Jennifer. And then we also have Jim Webster joining us, and Jim works in Boulder County's Land Use Department. Jim developed Wildfire Partners as a nationally recognized public-private partnership in collaboration with many colleagues and 35 partner organizations. Jim has been designing and implementing innovative natural resource-based initiatives for more than 30 years, and he has worked across the US and Africa as well. Welcome, Jim. So I would love to start with a question for both of you. And Jennifer, I'll give this to you first. I know you are both, fire is your professional focus. But I also know you both were personally affected by the fires. So Jennifer, starting with you, can you tell us a little bit about how you, your friends, and your staff were affected by the Marshall Fire?
Sure. I mean, this is a fire in our backyards, and we all know someone who was impacted or who lost homes. So I have staff who lost homes. The CU Boulder community was heavily impacted. There were 155 staff and students who lost homes in this wildfire. And the terror of being evacuated is something that is hard to experience and hard to process. And the road to recovery is going to be a long one. So, I think for me, somebody who's studied wildfire for several decades, for more than 20 years, it's hard to study something for that long and then to also have it happen in your backyard and know that we're all living with this risk in some way, shape, or form. And it will be a long time until we are able to build back in the way that is resilient. So that's my own experience of this fire and seeing it burn and knowing what was knowing what was happening and knowing the conditions. And the signal for me that this was a big and bad fire was the color of the smoke. And I knew that homes were burning, structural fires were happening based on the dark color that I could see from my vantage point. And I knew this was going to be a bad one.
Thank you, Jennifer. And we will unpack several things you just said there about risk and response and all of that. But first, Jim, if you would, could you share your personal experience with the fire?
Yeah, well, echo what Jennifer and Matt said. This happened to our community, to our neighbors, our friends, our coworkers. But I'll also add, it's when you work and your job is to help people prepare for wildfire, the division between personal and professional gets blurred. We're out there helping every day. So every fire is really, really tough on our staff, on our team. We're passionate about our work. And so we're working with homeowners to help them prepare for wildfire. And then one hits, and especially at this magnitude and scale, to see that impact. So it comes into that personal and professional aspect, like Jennifer and Matt said, because we're dealing with this every day, trying to help people prepare for wildfire, really a team going above and beyond, doing whatever we can to create fire adapted communities. So this hits really hard personally and professionally for all the county staff and our wildfire team in particular.
Oh, thank you for sharing that. So Jennifer, I just want to ask the question, like, what is up with the fire happening on December 30th? I mean, at the end of the year, in the middle of winter, what made this possible?
Yeah, there's a lot that goes into creating the conditions that are setting the stage for fire to happen. And the commissioner mentioned one big important one, which is we had the hottest June through December on record across the Front Range. I like to think about three major ingredients that are needed for fire, and that's a warm climate, fuels to burn, and an ignition source. And on top of one of the hottest periods on record for us going back to the 1960s. We also had a very wet spring that helped to grow grass fuels. And our grass fuels were above average in the total mass, essentially the biomass or the fuel to burn. And so our grassland systems had a lot of very fine fuel to burn. And an ignition source. And I think we're all aware that, you know, we play a big role in providing the ignitions that start a lot of our wildfires. In fact, human-caused ignitions are the main source of ignitions across the US. 84% of our wildfires actually started by people. And the single day of the year that has the most number of human-caused fires is July 4th. Over 7,000 events started in a 2-decade period on that single day. We play a huge role, and I think we forget how our daily activities can contribute to the problem. So we needed all three of those pieces, and we had them on December 30th, a warm climate, fuels to burn, and an ignition source. And so that set the stage for this. And then on top of that, what turned this into a disaster is that we have been building many homes literally in the line of fire for the past decades across the Front Range. And we had very unlucky high wind conditions as well.
And I'll just add that we no longer talk about a fire season. The number one lesson in our community wildfire protection plan is that wildfires take place at any time of the year. So we've had fires in January. We've had the 2009 Old Stage fire. We've had fires in November, another Old Stage fire in 1990. So the idea of a fire season, July, Jennifer mentioning being a peak, but also fires can happen year round. And we've had fires, and those were some fires I just mentioned in Boulder County, other places. So the message is that fires can happen any time of the year.
I think, oh, go ahead, Jennifer. Yeah, please.
So just to riff off of that, one really critical point is that our fire season is also longer now, in part because of a warming climate. And we're seeing fires later and later into the fall and now winter. There's only one other time in my career when I've talked about snow putting out a fire, and that was last year during the Cameron Peak fire. You know, this is a new era that we're in, and we've got a certain amount of lock-in on climate change, and fire is very responsive to a little bit of warming. And so that's part of what we're seeing here.
I think we're going to pick up on both these threads, but Jennifer, could you continue that thought about climate? Because we know you just had a new paper that came out today in the journal Nature that was looking at kind of the extension of warming evenings and night times as it relates to fire. Could you share with our audience what you've just recently also found? Because I think it's part of that larger climate conversation.
Yeah, so what we've been hearing anecdotally from our firefighting community is that they're fighting fires 24/7. And they're fighting fires now all season long. But what we looked at was globally how our nights are getting warmer. And in fact, our nights are getting warmer more so than our days are getting warmer. And what we're seeing in the fire signal is that our fires as a consequence are getting more intense, and they're passing from day to night to day to night to day to night. And so one of the mechanisms that's helping fires spread for longer periods of time is that our nights are now warmer as a function of climate change. In just the last 40 years, we've seen an increase in a metric we call vapor pressure deficit, which is a combo of temperature and relative humidity. You know, essentially what we're doing is we're creating more flammable nights as a function of climate change. And so what we discovered is that globally, our fires are more intense as a function of not only do we have the gas pedal on fires, but we're also losing the brakes on fires through the nighttime loss of nighttime humidity recovery.
One more quick follow-up question to that, and then Jim, if you have anything, and I know John will have questions too. Are we seeing an increase in the number of fires or a decrease? This was an audience question that someone had submitted.
Would you like me to take a stab at that? Or
yeah, if you can, that would be great.
Yes, it depends on where in the world you're talking about. In the Western US, we've seen a doubling of forests that have burned since the 1980s. And that's directly linked to an increase in temperature and warming and how dry fuels are as a function of a warming climate. Now, there are places in the world that are seeing a decrease in fire, and that's largely related to shifts in land use and land use patterns. So the loss of agricultural burning in places like sub-Saharan Africa, for example, are places in the world we're actually seeing a decrease in anthropogenic fire, but there are places where we're seeing an increase in wildfires.
So Jennifer, you mentioned, and I'll start with you, but I'd be interested in Jim's thought on this as well. You mentioned ignition sources. You of course have to have an ignition. And we know that the source of the Marshall Fire is still under investigation. So, we are still figuring out what exactly happened there. But could you speak more generally to the range of things that can start fires and the ratio of, so fires happen naturally in Colorado, they always have, but how is that shifting with human-caused fires?
Yeah, it's a really important question. And you can think about ignitions in two major buckets. One is lightning ignitions. That's really one of the only natural sources of ignitions for fires, unless you live next to a volcano. The other major bucket of ignitions is from people. And people have been using fire for a very long time, and are going back even to our early hominid ancestors who were using fire more than 1 million years ago. So it's really tied to our human existence, and we don't even think about it, but sources of ignitions can be campfires, can be cigarettes, can be driving off the side of the road with a hot tailpipe. It can be power lines going down. It can be using yard equipment that sparks. There's a lot of different ways that we start ignitions. Fireworks is another big one. There's a lot of different things that we do that provide the source of an ignition for a wildfire.
And can you say anything about this topic of dormant coal mines or burning coal mines? And I invite either of you who know something about this. We got quite a few inquiries about this. Like, what are these burning dormant coal mines, and where are they, and how worried should we be about them?
Jim, did you want to take that one?
It's a tough one. It's not, I'm not the expert to answer that question. But yes, when people heard of that as a potential source, of course, the fire is still under investigation, but there have been Colorado fires started in the past by coal mines, and I can't tell you where they all exist, but they're out there.
And I think the important thing, though, to remember here is it's tied to a human-caused source. So those coal mines are burning, and part of the reason they're burning is because coal is a fuel source, and they can burn for very long periods of time because that fuel source doesn't go away. And so that, I think, is kind of a critical and also terribly ironic in terms of if that is the source of this fire, and obviously it has been the source of other fires, but it's tied to our fossil fuel combustion. It's tied to our need as a society to burn fossil fuels, which is pumping greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, which is making our wildfires worse. And so it's just one more aspect that we need to reflect on and figure out how we can reduce that potential source of ignition or reduce the risk around that potential source of ignition.
I'm going to pivot us a little bit because I want to pick up on something that I think all three of you have briefly touched on a little bit, which is the wildland-urban interface, or the wonderful acronym WUI. In our series last year, we heard a lot about how we need to think about the WUI, the wildland-urban interface, differently, more than rural homes living next to the woods or dense forest. And perhaps how we've typically thought about the wildland-urban interface. I think the Marshall Fire in particular really indicates how we need to think about expanding that concept, or at least our understanding, if the concept has already been expanded, to think about the role of grasslands and these suburban environments. So how should we be thinking about the wildland-urban interface? And I bet you both have something to say to this. So I'm looking to you, Jim. Jim, do you want to start? And then Jennifer, please add.
Sure. We can talk a little bit about statewide perspective, but from a county perspective, every county with a wildfire risk is required to develop a community wildfire protection plan. And as part of that community wildfire protection plan, every county needs to define the WUI. But the question is what you do with that definition. So for Boulder County, we defined two WUIs. We defined a forest WUI and a grassland WUI that covers the county. So we have that definition in our planning documents. But the key thing for local governments is to decide where our wildfire mitigation programs, our regulations, and our outreach apply. So we, in Boulder County, have targeted it on high-risk areas. And as Matt said, we focused, in terms of our high-risk communities in Boulder County, in the foothills and the mountains, the forested regions. And that's been since 1989. And so we recognized there was a grassland WUI with some impacts, but with our resources and our targets, we focused on the forested foothills and mountains. So as Matt said, not expecting a fire in Louisville, and now we'll have to relook, and we are already in the process of relooking at the programs, the regulations, the actions that we take to prepare for wildfire. Commissioner Jones mentioned things like underinsurance and go bags and things like that. We've been talking for a long time with folks in the mountains and foothills, and they're prepared. They've evacuated, they understand that process. And that was new in this fire. So expanding the definition of the WUI. There have been studies, Colorado State Forest Service and other statewide studies that show that more than half of Colorado residents live in the WUI. So there's been documentation that a large percentage of Coloradans are at some level of wildfire risk. But that doesn't mean we have programs in place, actions, regulations to address that risk. So part of it is defining the WUI, but part of it is building our programs, and we'll be talking about policies later, but that it all stems from that risk assessment or those definitions of areas at risk.
Thank you, Jim. And we also heard in last spring from one or two of our guests about how even with respect to water supplies and so forth, we are also in a wildland-urban interface, even if you're nestled in the middle of a city and not exposed to fire, but still exposed to the effects of the fires. But I want to ask you, about what you mentioned that, the focus has been on forests. And I was even struck in the wake of the Marshall Fire, the first several articles I read in the news, they would write a paragraph or two about the Marshall Fire, and then they would pivot to all we were doing in forests. So it seems like this shift to paying attention to grasslands and the potential of including them in the WUI is something that we really need to figure out. But I'm particularly curious what you think about several questions that came up from our audience have to do with the role of open space in either exacerbating fires or helping to prepare for fires. And then specifically, what might the role of prescribed fires or grazing be on these grasslands to reduce fuel loads to help deal with that situation Jennifer described of really abundant grass growth that's still available to burn in December?
Lots of good questions there. In terms of the open space, there's also a lot of values associated with open space. And we've looked in past fires, if we think of all those areas that have been conserved as open space, if those would have been housing developments, how many more homes we would have lost in the Cowwood Fire, in the Marshall Fire. And so, reducing the number of homes in harm's way is important. So open space has lots of values. And we saw also, we did a post-disaster investigation of Marshall Fire. There were buildings destroyed, even commercial structures surrounded by parking lots. We can't pave everything because embers can travel miles. So you can pave areas around homes to try to reduce wildfire risk. You can still lose homes because embers can ignite those structures. So, we've had situations in the past where in the forested areas, people point their finger and say it's all US Forest Service or BLM or the public land manager's fault. What we ask residents to do is prepare their homes and take action. And we're really looking at grasses 30 feet from the home. So I think, the fact that open space was involved in acres burned in this fire, or whether it's public land and US Forest Service, there's management activities that can contribute to reduce risk. But, we live in systems historically that have burned, that will continue to burn. The more houses we put on that open space puts more people at risk. So there's lots of values to open space, and I don't see that as the culprit or the problem here.
And I'll give some perspective too on the WUI question and how we think about the WUI. We did work that showed through the use of 200 million housing records from Zillow across the country that more than 1 million homes were within wildfire boundaries over the last 2 decades, and another 59 million were within a kilometer. And what that work really demonstrated was that we're living with high risk across the country, and particularly in the Western US. And I think part of the challenge that we're facing is that Colorado is a flammable place. Our grasses are flammable, our shrubs are flammable, our trees are flammable for large portions of the year. And those times are getting longer as a function of climate change. So we do have risk stacked upon risk, and we haven't really fully evaluated how do we protect those homes that we've built into flammable places. And there are things we can do to reduce our risk. And we haven't considered, the adjacency to flammable vegetation in the same way that we consider flood risk to homes. For example, we've got floodplain maps that help to incentivize insurance decisions and development decisions, but we don't have the equivalent for fire probabilities. Counties and local governments are left to make those decisions on their own rather than having national incentive programs to help shift the risk and to reduce it and to create more resilient communities, as opposed to leaving individual homeowners with all the decisions around what materials they build with. Can they reduce their fuel around their homes? Can they change the materials that they're building with? So there's a lot we can do, but I do hope we can create resilient communities through individual decisions, but also through, state level and national policies too.
Jim, you had a call. Jennifer, I want to pick up on something you said a little bit here, because I think, and John and I think I spoke to this last year a little bit, but I would like your all's perspective as you think about how do we build that resilient community or resilience in ourselves and understanding our own individual risk and a risk at large. We've talked about, and I mentioned this at the beginning, that there are historical and ancient and indigenous practices that are very understanding of how to live with wildfire and fire, and thinking about our relationship to fire. A question from the audience was alluding to our values, right? And is there a new value system or a culture or a way of thinking about fire that you don't think we're really touching on right now when it comes to a lot of us who historically, right, we heard Commissioner Jones say, I never expected to have a wildfire at my house, right? I think there's a lot of sentiment around that. I'm wondering if you could speak to that maybe a little bit, of Jennifer and Jim, please, as well, too.
Yeah, I think one really important point to make here too is there's good fire and there's bad fire. And I think we've really lost sight of the good fire that can be used to manage our landscapes. And we can do more of that. And I think, what I'm talking about is prescribed burning and our public acceptance of that. It doesn't come without any risk, but it sure does change the equation in terms of how fires move and the behavior that the firefighting community will see. I mean, that's one piece of the solution. And Native Americans and indigenous peoples around the world who live in grassland systems have used fire for millennia in what's called patchwork burning, where they burn frequently in different patches to essentially remove fuels for future intense, devastating fires. And that's a well-documented and utilized tool in the management of flammable grassland systems.
Agree. I mean, climate adaptation and resiliency are very important for Colorado when it comes to wildfire mitigation. We've been talking about climate adaptation and resiliency in our wildfire programs in the 12 years I've been with Boulder County. And I've attended national meetings like the National Adaptation Forum, huge meetings with lots of participants, lots of presentations, speakers, posters. We had one panel in 2019 on wildfire, lots of talk about sea level rise and people on the coast. But for Colorado, wildfire and preparing for wildfire is really one of our most important climate adaptation and resiliency issues. So we need to develop those fire adapted communities, living with fire, everything that Jennifer just mentioned. That's an important part of our future here in Colorado, is to adapt and to be resilient, and wildfires is the center component. So it's a change. It's a new, and we've talked about a new day, preparing. It is a different future that we're headed towards with increased wildfire risk. And that means we're going to have to adapt and become resilient. And that's important for individual homes, for neighborhoods, for communities, for local governments. This adaptation resiliency needs to increase our efforts to address these risks.
And Jim, building on that, and for Jennifer as well, you both have mentioned, you've referenced several times policies and practices that we need to continue to implement. So there's quite a lot in place already, but you've both said not enough. We still don't have the policies and practices for resiliency and response and whatnot that we really need to have in place. What would you say are policies and practices that we do not yet have in place that we need to really be thinking about and working on?
I'll start. It starts at that homeowner action, that individual taking care of that property. And so people need technical assistance, they need financial assistance, they need support. The idea that somebody can listen to a public service announcement and figure out everything they need to do. Hardening your home, creating defensible space takes some time and some money and some expertise. So we need to bring those services to individuals to support them in their climate adaptation and resiliency work to properly harden their home and create defensible space. So those are the programs that we work on. And instead of just a public service announcement and some education and outreach, or maybe a website and video, we need people on site, one-on-one technical assistance with customized plans. So it's much more intense than doing a little bit of education and outreach. We actually need action, and people need to take action. And so local governments, counties, need to have programs that provide that technical assistance and financial assistance, because it's not easy. People think of some of the measures, cutting your grass and cleaning out gutters. That's easy. So we can just tell people to go out and do it. But there's a lot of things that are more sophisticated. Looking at how to harden your home takes that technical expertise to see where the vulnerabilities are. So we really need to provide assistance, technical and financial, to homeowners to prepare for wildfire. We can't expect them just to listen to 1 hour or read one article and go out and do everything that needs to be done with the level of effort that's required. It's not simply getting a shot, clicking a buckle, writing a check. It's much more involved. It's changing how you live and living with fire and understanding that fire behavior, how homes burn. So it's a huge effort.
And Jennifer, what can you add? I'm particularly curious around we've talked about WUI. You mentioned 1 million homes that are in fires, in fire footprints, and then also you mentioned prescribed burning. What do we need to change about our thinking and our actions and our policies to address those issues?
To address which ones?
Particularly the the distribution of homes that are in these fire-prone areas, but then also the prescribed fires that you mentioned, the good fires. And how do we do more of that? And what's standing in the way of us doing more of that?
Yeah, each of those is like such a great and probably an hour-long conversation, but I'll try and give you like my upshot, which is, thinking about not only what is a home built out of, but what is the constellation of homes within a community. I think this is kind of where we also need to think about community level resilience too, because you own your neighbor's risk too, because that wood fence that they have is also a potential ignition or ember source for you too. And so I think this is where we need to be thinking more collectively about solutions too. And it ranges. And as Jim said, like it's hard to retrofit homes to be more fire resilient. If you build a new home today, there's a great study by Headwaters Economics that demonstrates that you can build a fire resilient home for the same cost as it costs you to build a conventional home today. Sure, that's great for all the new homes that are going to be built, but what do we do about retrofitting the homes that currently exist today? And as Jim mentioned, it's expensive, and it can be expensive to do all the things that we need to do. So, like I said before, we have floodplain maps to help direct development and insurance decisions and incentive programs, but we don't have the equivalent for fire. Another thing that's really critical is we need to be thinking about vulnerable populations in this equation too. There's 13 million socially vulnerable Americans living with high wildfire risk who may not have the resources to do the things that we're talking about in terms of creating defensible space, removing fuels, building with fire resistant materials, metal roofs, fiber, cement siding, changing vent sizes and double pane windows. These are all things that can help reduce risk. We need to be thinking about programs and incentive structures that can help the most vulnerable. And on the prescribed burn front, I think what's critical too is a cultural and societal acceptance of more, burning when it's low risk days, cooler temperatures, moisture conditions. We're going to see more, functionally, we're going to see more smoke from prescribed burns, that it's hard to mitigate that impact. But we need to suffer through a little bit of smoke in order to reduce the risk of, more intense fires. So it's not a question of if, it's a question of how do we want our smoke? We're going to see smoke as a function of more fires. So how do we want that? And can we direct and do more prescribed burning that would essentially help reduce that future risk?
And we've quickly touched on home hardening and defensible space, emergency preparedness, and prescribed fire. We haven't talked a lot about forest treatments, but that's a big part of the equation too, in terms of our forested landscape and having healthy forest. And whether it be the U.S. Forest Service or BLM, the need to support forest management in addition to prescribed fire, they're combined together. And some folks, in terms of, we love to plant trees, we love trees, and we don't want to cut down any trees, but the message for healthy forest is we need to manage our forest and have public support for the Forest Service to do treatment on public lands at a scale that's significant with fire behavior. So the forest treatment and support for land managers to, yes, actually cut trees is supportive in getting our forests back into their historic range of variability and understanding what a healthy forest is. So we haven't talked a lot about this, but that's part of the policy discussion in addition to the home hardening, defensible space, prescribed fire piece.
Yeah, I appreciate both of you articulating that. And it's things we talked about last year, but I think you both did a really nice job of just cutting through and articulating it very well. I want to bring a question in from our audience here that is pretty much around the idea of needing to balance interest and needs, particularly during a disaster response. So the question in general is specifically tied to what some folks have been hearing around current fire victims here in the Marshall Fire, being concerned about new regulatory policies that is requiring more sustainable building practices, yet is potentially impeding their ability to rebuild and the need and the cost for doing that, whether that's through reliefs or waivers. And so how can and how should we be thinking about the need to balance something like this during a disaster scenario, right, where those very measures, as this person writes, are intended to help, avoid future wildfire conditions, but at the same time, we have victim recovery efforts needing to go on. Response during a disaster, there's a lot of attention paid to it, right? So a lot of this conversation we're talking about too is some of the preparedness. But what do we do right now with some of those competing needs that we're seeing in our community?
Yeah, and so we're discussing that now in Boulder County in terms of the what the rebuild for the Marshall Fire will look like. And there's ongoing meetings and discussions, and Commissioner Jones is involved in some of those decisions and our new regulations regarding rebuilding. And so they're difficult community discussions, and we're having those right now. I mean, the good news, as Jennifer mentioned with the Headwaters Economic Report, is a lot of the ignition resistant construction requirements that didn't happen weren't in place in the Marshall Fire footprint in the past. Things like a Class A roof are standard now. I mean, people don't build in general Class B or C roofs. We have ignition resistant asphalt, those Class A shingles that are readily available. The screening of the vents, putting down that rebury and gravel is a small expense. And we're looking at some potentials. The windows, vinyl windows are at risk. So having those reinforced is a potential cost. But when you look at wildfire, 1 week leak in the house, so you can put in some really good measures, but if it's not an a la carte menu where you pick and choose and say, okay, I'm gonna have really good windows, but I don't wanna, do anything in terms of my deck, in terms of ignition resistant construction, then your house burns down anyway. So that's the technical expertise, is that we wanna build back safer and stronger because it's cheaper in the long run. If the house burns again and you have to rebuild it after a few years, you're not really saving anything up front. So we look at the long-term cost, not just the upfront cost. And fortunately, with the research that we have, that there's not a lot of additional costs associated with the ignition-resistant construction. But in today's climate, with COVID and supply chains and cost, it is a really important issue that, our policymakers will have to decide what those requirements are, recognizing the challenges. But that happens after every fire. Talking to folks with California, they'll say, well, Boulder County will be just like the rest of the country. They won't have any ignition resistant requirements for rebuilding. And we'll see. I think there will probably be some, because I think they make sense.
Thank you, Jim. We're getting close to the end here. We're going to wrap up at 6 o'clock. And I want to ask you both about things that people can do. But before getting there, one more question. I think it's mostly for you, Jim. And I wonder if you could speak a little bit to the complexities and coordination challenges around emergency response. And we've had questions even in, from the audience, we've had questions about people getting lost trying to find places. And I've seen articles in the news about how there are multiple jurisdictions that have to be coordinated. And of course, everything's happening so fast in this environment with 110-mile-an-hour winds and so on. So can you speak a little bit more to what you all experience and think about with respect to these complexities and coordination and so forth?
Yeah, it's a challenge. Our Office of Emergency Management works really hard in preparation for events such as this. And no one wants surprises, and we want to prepare and have everything in place in advance. And it can get complicated. We have advances in technology that I think we keep improving and learning things from each disaster. So it's not my responsibility or area of expertise, but there's a lot of people spending a lot of time thinking about this and trying to improve. And really conscientious folks it's a complicated situation, and the county is working hard to get out those messages and using the best technology and investing, as Commissioner Jones mentioned in the beginning, is really taking this seriously and improving any way we can. And that's the partnership with the people, in terms of people take responsibility for signing up and doing the emergency preparedness piece. And we can go and give meetings and talk till we're blue in the face of everybody getting a to-go bag. And if people think, oh, I'm not at risk, I'm not going to do that, or I'll get to it later. So there is an urgency around these issues, but sometimes that preparedness takes a back seat because it's there's things that are going on that we need to recover and respond to. So we need to spend that time on the preparation up front, and we'll be continuing to focus on that.
Yeah, great. Well, Jim, that's a great setup for my last question that we'd love to have both of you respond to. So you mentioned individual preparedness and even having a to-go bag, even when we tend to think that we're not at risk in the middle of town, but we may well be. Commissioner Jones mentioned donating for people who want to help, acting on climate, and acting on resiliency. What else would you add for our audience? What should we be doing? What actions should we take? What calls should we be making to our representatives and so forth?
I think this is, speaking for local government and working for local government, a lot of responsibility lies on local government and the homeowner. Sometimes we look to the federal government and state government to solve a problem. With wildfire mitigation, preparedness, resiliency, it's really at that local level. So we need local leaders, local champions within neighborhoods, within HOAs, within communities to become active and engaged in this issue. And that's how policymakers can have support. Right now, it's tough for policymakers to pass regulations or implement some of the sticks and carrots that are necessary because they lack the public support. So that grassroots support of this issue is critical. Not just of the individual homeowner preparing their home and all the emergency preparedness work that we talked about and working with their neighbors, but that the next level, working in the community and local governments to support more activity at the local level, because there's a lot of things that local governments can do with their community partners. We can't look to the states or the feds to solve this problem. It's a local issue that local governments with their residents and their active leaders. So there's an opportunity ripe for people that want to become engaged on this issue, that care about it, to work with their HOAs, to work with their counties, to really build fire adapted communities. That's our goal. I'm on an organization called Fire Adapted Colorado. I'm on the board. We've been working for a long time to create fire adapted communities throughout the state. And so that's what we need. We need more communities to step up with more local leaders and grassroots community members to really lead this effort.
Thank you, Jim. And Jennifer, why don't you close this out? And also, in addition to actions, is there anything else you want to add in terms of what we should know, how we should be thinking about wildfire and wildfire preparedness?
Yeah, I think one thing that we didn't touch on a whole lot is the ignition piece of the puzzle too. And I think one thing I'll add is we need Smokey Bear in the suburbs just as much as we need Smokey Bear thinking about wildfires in the woods. Like we do have a human ignition problem. And if we can think about the ways that our everyday lives can contribute to the ignition problem, I think we can take away a piece of that puzzle. And so I would reflect on that, and how do we create messaging campaigns during red flag high wind warning days that can help reduce our risk as well. That's a piece that I think we can tackle. And I'll end with saying, I think that we started with the two most important messages, which are act on climate and let's build resilient communities. And those are the bigger picture things that we need to focus on.
Great. Thank you. Thank you all so much, Jennifer, Jim, and of course, Commissioner Jones, for joining us this evening, for sharing your thoughts and your insights and providing our audience, hopefully with a lot of more deeper thinking, some actions and things that they can take. I really thoroughly enjoyed the conversation myself this evening. John, thank you also for being here with me as a co-host and a partner in this series. I want to take just a moment to share. Nicole from our team has dropped in some resources. We'll also share these out in an email. There's a ton of links that we have. We'll hopefully be in communication with additional things for those who are interested, including ways that you can support Boulder County residents who were directly impacted by the Marshall Fire, as well as just wanting to learn and understand a little bit more about the complexity of wildfire as it impacts us where we live, and rethinking how we think about that wildland-urban interface and where our homes are. I want to acknowledge a huge thank you to the Gates Family Foundation. They've been a longtime supporter of the Institute, and they helped support us financially in the series last year. So thank you for their financial support, as well as a number of partners who you don't see on the screen here, but always are great sounding boards and help bring this all together. Of course, the teams that John has at his center, my Institute colleagues, my Denver Museum of Nature and Science colleagues, the Colorado Forest Restoration Institute, the Southern Rockies Fire Science Network, the Colorado State Forest Service, and the Climate Adaptation Partnership. They were all heavily instrumental in last year's series. And so huge thank you to all those people involved. It always takes a lot of people to put this together. Thank you to our audience for joining in. I apologize we could not get to all your questions, but hopefully we provide you with a wonderful evening, and hopefully you stay safe. We know it's snowing a lot for many people who live here in the Front Range, and hopefully we'll see you again in a future program. So thank you.
Thank you all.
Thank you.